Bom, agora chegou a hora do nosso primeiro palestrante. Ele é vice-presidente do Mises Institute, é editor do Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, especialista em teoria monetária, economia comparativa e de economia austríaca, e história do ensinamento econômico. É coautor do curso de economia austríaca, disponível em DVD, que vai ser transformado em livro. O nome é Fundamentals of Economic Analysis. Nessa exposição, ele vai explicar para a gente quem foram, afinal, esses são considerados os maiores expoentes da escola austríaca de economia. Eu peço aí os aplausos para Joe Salerno, nosso primeiro expositor.
May I move this? I want to place this here. Okay.
Put it here and I will save it. Okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Not very.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am deeply honored and really thrilled to be here as the opening speaker of the first Brazilian conference in Austrian economics. When I first became acquainted with Austrian economics as a college student in the early 1970s, I met no other Austrian for 2 years. I remember reading Murray Rothbard's book, America's Great Depression, while I worked as a janitor sweeping floors. I would sneak off on my own and read the book in a small janitor's room. Mike? Okay. As I was saying before Mark Thornton interrupted me, I would sneak off on my own and read the book in a small janitor's room. I felt so alone. I was alone. I was hiding from my boss and reading a book by myself in a closet. I could never have imagined back then that today I would be speaking to an audience of hundreds in Brazil about Mises and Rothbard, 6 months after I attended a conference in Spain on the works of the Spanish scholastics. I want to thank Elio Beltro and the dedicated staff of the Mises Institute of Brazil for making such a wonderful event possible. For me, this is indeed a dream come true. Now there are even more people who will be reading Austrian economics with me out in the open. Okay. Who were Mises and Rothbard? The short answer is they were vocational economists in an age of professionalization. In this lecture, I will explain that this answer is the key to understanding the way they lived their lives and the intellectual contributions that they made. Mises and Rothbard were born 2 generations apart, and they were worlds apart in cultural background and personal temperament. But despite these differences, they shared important similarities, both in their intellectual attitudes and in their scholarly careers. Both men were creative geniuses who constructed an imposing system of economic theory. They both worked in virtual isolation, outside of mainstream academia, during very productive periods of their lives. Both published great treatises on economic science at crucial turning points in economic thought. These treatises saved Austrian economics and sound economics in general from falling into oblivion. Both Mises and Rothbard were passionate and intransigent seekers of truth who never deviated from Karl Menger's original vision of the economy as the outcome of the valuations and choices of individual human beings. The most important similarity they shared, however, was that they were both vocational economists in an era when economics was becoming increasingly professionalized. What is a vocational economist? And what qualities distinguish him from a professional economist? The dictionary defines vocation as the work or function to which a person is called, a mode of life or employment regarded as requiring dedication. Ludwig von Mises defined vocation by distinguishing between 2 different kinds of labor. The first he called introversive labor, and the second extroversive labor. You will not find these precise words or their equivalent in an English or Portuguese dictionary. Mises coined these terms in order to address an important distinction in human action. Introversive labor is a labor undertaken solely for its own sake and not as a means to another end. Extroversive labor, in contrast, is performed because the individual prefers income or other rewards that he can earn by working to the pleasure of leisure that he sacrifices. Mises described the two most conspicuous examples of introversive labor. The first is the search for truth and knowledge pursued for its own sake, and not as a means of improving one's own efficiency and skill for other tasks. The second is true sport, which one practices without any desire for social recognition or success. Mises always referred to mountain climbing, which was one of his favorite pastimes, as an example of true sport. The effort expended by the scientific truth seeker, that is, we scholars, or the mountain climber, does not involve the usual disutility of labor. The labor itself is the source of satisfaction. So from the point of view of the science of human action, seeking truth in economics, when it is pursued as an end in itself, directly satisfies the scientific researcher or scholar. It is therefore a vocation. Now, the search for new truth in economics requires many things in addition to intellectual efforts of the vocational economist. It also requires complementary goods like books, journals, research facilities, conferences, clerical assistance, and other kinds of labor. Most of these things must be purchased on the market. In addition, the vocational economist requires the kinds of consumer goods, various kinds of consumer goods, to sustain his existence and give him the health and the energy to carry on his research. These things, too, must be purchased on the market. The founding members of the Austrian school did not pursue research for monetary gain or because they were seeking professional recognition or as an influence on public policy. According to Mises, when Menger, Brombacherk, and Wieser began their scientific careers, and now I'm quoting, they considered it as their vocation to put economic theory on a sound basis, and they dedicated themselves entirely to this cause, unquote. Note the words that Mises used in this statement, vocation and dedicated. These three eminent Austrians, therefore, were not economists by profession, but by vocation. The vocational economist takes a position in the university or works in some other profession, such as banking, journalism, industry, or government. He does so in order to obtain the concrete means necessary to sustain his effort to discover new truths or to teach and apply established truths in his economic research and writing. The professional economist also works in the same jobs, but his ultimate aims are very different. He seeks to accumulate wealth, draw praise from his peers, achieve public fame, or shape political policies. Most likely, he aims at a combination of these ends. Thus, the difference between the vocational economist and the professional economist is not their objective method of earning a living, but the subjective ends that they aim at. But despite the subjective element involved, the two kinds of economists can easily be distinguished from each other because they differ sharply in the views they express towards the truth content and the perceived rewards of economic research. They also have a deep respect for the past and for past contributions of economics because they believe that these contain truth. As vocational economists, both Mises and Rothbard display deep respect for the earlier contributions in the tradition of sound economics. This was particularly true with regard to their mentors. Mises' mentor was the great Brombacherk. Mises himself was Rothbard's mentor and the person to whom Rothbard dedicated his treatise, Man, Economy, and State. Not only did Mises and Rothbard recognize the contributions of their predecessors in the development of economic science, they also actively use these contributions in their own work. Mises was one of the leading proponents of the Austrian subjective theory of value. Sure. Okay. Should get down. Now, this subjective theory of value had replaced the objective cost of production theory held by the British classical school of David Hume, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo. Mises, however, further developed subjective value theory by correcting the founders of the subjective value doctrine, Menger and Bombaver, who had not fully realized that utility and value could not be measured and quantified. Mises demonstrated that value was strictly ordinal and involved a ranking of goods by individual actors. As such, Mises argued, values could be neither added together nor compared between different individuals. Mises then formulated a theory of monetary calculation based on this subjective theory of value. He showed how the subjective and ordinal valuations of individual consumers are transformed by the free market into a system of objective and cardinal prices. This system of prices is used by entrepreneurs to calculate their profits and losses and to rationally allocate resources. Mises went on to show that under socialism, where private property and the means of production was absent, and the state controlled all capital goods, exchange and market prices could not exist. Without real market prices, economic calculation would be impossible. Under socialism, therefore, no objective guide would exist for allocating scarce resources, and production would be chaotic, and human life and civilization would come to a quick end as we know it. All of this was derived by Mises from the original subjective theory of value. As Mises revealed in his memoirs, notes, and recollections, it was only after he already was a mature economist of nearly 50 years old that he felt competent to criticize his masters, Menger and Bombaver. And when he did criticize them, he was careful to emphasize that the problem lay with inconsistencies between certain statements they made in their expositions and books and the correct fundamental principles of their subjective value doctrine. Mises not only drew from the intellectual legacy of his predecessors and mentors, but also learned from the new ideas and criticisms of his colleagues and students, whom he often generously credited with inspiring improvements in his own theories. With respect to his path-breaking theory of money and credit, Mises wrote, "I owe a great deal to the stimulation of the works of B.M. Anderson, T.E. Gregory, Dennis Robertson, Albert Hahn, Friedrich Hayek, and Fritz Machlup. They induced me to reconsider my theory and improve its presentation. I learned genuinely from the writings of these men." So Mises was an incredibly humble man intellectually. When Rothbard published Man, Economy, and State, Mises reviewed it and enthusiastically endorsed it. He called Rothbard's work an epical contribution to the general science of human action. He then went on to declare, quote, "Henceforth, all essential studies in these branches of knowledge will have to take account of the theories and criticisms expounded by Dr. Rothbard," unquote. Mises gave high praise to Rothbard's treatise, despite the fact that parts of the book were intended to correct and improve upon the system of economic theory that Mises himself had presented earlier in Human Action. One area in particular where Rothbard explicitly disagreed with Mises was the theory of monopoly. Mises had conceded that the formulation of a monopoly price above the competitive price was theoretically conceivable in an unhampered market, although highly unlikely to occur in practice.